A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Schabbos at the Skizzar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehudi Gerber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been generously sponsored by a loyal and dedicated listener of Jewish History Soundbites as a schus for bracha and atzlacha for the sponsor, his family, and all of Klal Yisrael. And this podcast is also sponsored by the family of Mr. Michael Neubiger, Reb Shimon Michal ben Hachaver Rav Yitzchak, on the occasion of his 10th yahrzeit, which falls out, just happened today, on the 16th of Av. Mr. Neubiger was born in 1945 in Stamford Hill in London. Before the war, the Neubiger family were members of the Kehilas Adas Yeshurun of Frankfurt. Following his escape from Nazi Germany, Michael Neubiger's father served as the Reish HaKol of the known Yekish Golders Green Beis Medrash monks. His son, Michael Neubiger, in turn, was devoted to Minhagei Ashkenaz in Frankfurt and was a loyal member of the Golders Green Beis Medrash for over 50 years, investing much time and koiches into its communal institutions. Mr. Michael Neubiger always felt a strong connection to the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, who was related to the Neubiger family, and there were memories among family members who had traveled, the ancestors of the family who had traveled to the Baal Shem of Michelstadt while he was alive and had received a bracha and a Yeshua. Mr. Michael Neubiger was devoted to tefillah during his lifetime and traveled on several occasions to Michelstadt to daven. May his neshama have an aliyah and may be melitz yosher for his family and all of Klal Yisrael. So I want to introduce the topic today. We're going to speak about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. It was his title for posterity. His official name was Rav Yitzchak Aryeh, or Reb Zekl Leib Vormser, but he's better known to history as the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. Now, on my trips to Germany, which is not as often as I would like, but we do go to Michelstadt. I remember going there. It's a quaint little town outside of Frankfurt. It's beautiful. So we always go to Frankfurt, and then we usually go to southern Germany, to Mainz, and to Worms, and to the other towns in southern Germany. Sometimes we make it up to Hamburg, or Berlin, or Munich, and other parts of Germany. There's loads of Jewish history, and I wish we would do more Germany trips. First of all, you could call it Ashkenaz if Germany sounds too harsh. Not enough. I wish there was more. There is a natural aversion that groups have of going to Germany because of the Nazis, and I understand that. But there is, on the other hand, tons of Jewish history, and it's a pity to miss out on it. So one of the highlights of the trips to Germany is the visit to Michelstadt, right outside Frankfurt, where we go to the kever of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. And it's in his story and the world that he lived in is the topic of today. Now, before getting into our today's subject, I want to talk about Jewish history soundbites for a minute. I'm sure many of you out there would like, as I do, would like to the podcast to grow and reach new audiences. And the best way for you to do that is, one, to tell your family and friends about Jewish history soundbites and encourage others to listen. And number two, to leave a rating and, if possible, even a review on your favorite listening platform. So if you can do that, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Now let's get back into the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. Who was this Rav Yitzchak Aryeh, or Reb Zekl Leib Vormser, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt? And he was this Baal Shem, a kabbalist, a mystic, who was Baal Shem is someone who used shemos, who used names of Hashem, of Malachim, of all kinds of kabbalistic formulas, and we'll get into that. And he lived in southern Germany, in Michelstadt, next to Frankfurt, and he lived in the 19th century, the end of the 18th and the early 19th century, almost to the mid-19th century, passed away in 1847. So this is someone who you would not associate the Baal Shem with the Baal Shem Tov or other ones in Eastern Europe, and here's this kabbalist who lives after the Baal Shem Tov. This is in a different century, right? He lives not long after. He's born 8 years or so after the Baal Shem Tov had passed away, but it's a different part of the world. It's a Yeki in Germany, in a very different environment, in a very different milieu, and he's a Baal Shem, and he's this kabbalist, and he's like this miracle worker, and it's fascinating that it's in this specific context. And in fact, the three interesting things about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt don't really have to do with him himself. They have to do with, one, his name or title or occupation, however you want to call it, the Baal Shem part of his title. The second one is his time period that he lived in, and the third one is his geographic location. I want to unpack that just a bit. First of all, what is a Baal Shem and who gets the title? So it's many people throughout Jewish history have gotten this title Baal Shem. There was Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem, there was I had a whole long list of Baal Shem. I didn't include it in my notes, but there's quite a few well-known Baal Shem throughout Jewish history. And it basically means a kabbalist, a mystic, someone who utilizes the names of Hashem or angels or kabbalistic formulas, and they're healers of people. They heal people who are sick. Many times they're folk healers. People come to them with ailments, and the Baal Shem heals them. And this was all the Baal Shem. This was kind of like an occupation. It was almost like a doctor, and the Baal Shem Tov himself was like that, and many others. So basically, this Baal Shem of Michelstadt, that's Rabbi Zekl Leib Vormser, was like that as well. And the ones who were remembered by history are the more prominent ones. They were big tzaddikim. They weren't just Kabbalists who healed people. They were big tzaddikim. They were prominent in the way this Baal Shem of Michelstadt, we're going to see, was a Rosh Yeshiva. He was a rabbi, and other things about them that their names are remembered to posterity. And there are obviously many more that their identities have been lost to history. What's interesting is that I did a bit of an analysis, and I tried to look around for the different Baal Shem who are famous, and he seems to be the last one. In other words, the latest one. He's deep into the 1800s, and doesn't seem to crop up in too many places after that. In other words, we don't really see that title bestowed upon anyone. And the Moroccan version of it, where you have the Baba, which is kind of similar in a way, does continue right up until this very day, but it doesn't exactly have the same title as Baal Shem. And so it's interesting that the last Baal Shem is in the rapidly secularizing Germany, far away from the traditional Eastern Europe, and he's the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. He seems to be the last prominent one, and that's point number one. That's his title, Baal Shem. Another fascinating thing I found about his story, again, not so much about him, about his context, about his world, is when did he live? He's born in 1768, and he passes away in 1847. Now, why are those dates significant? First of all, because it's after the Baal Shem Tov. It's after the spread of the Hasidic movement, like I said. So this has nothing to do with Hasidus per se, and it's after, the one who was most famous for having this name had already passed on from the world, and he's living in his environment, and he lives well into the 1800s, and he's a Kabbalist. He's in his world, in his place, and that brings us to the third point, that he was in Michelstadt. He was not in Eastern Europe. He was in Germany, not Germany like in Poznan or Breslau near the Polish border. Today, Wrocław, it's in Poland, and it's not that part of Germany. It's Western Germany, southwestern Germany, the old Ashkenaz, the Rhine River Valley, where the old Ashkenaz Jewish communities were from the beginning of Ashkenaz, right near where Rashi studied Torah before he returned to France, right near where the Marami Rutenberg and the Maril and all these great tzaddikim lived. So that's where he lives. That's his environment. Not only that, but again, going back to the dates that he lived, this is his formative years are already during the German Enlightenment, the early secularization. By the time he passes away in 1847, we can say that the majority of German Jewry is either Reform or more likely completely secular, the majority, or some of them even assimilated. I mean, it's right. This is the time that the Frankfurt community that he was next door to had collapsed religiously. Just around the corner, a few years after his passing, the Frankfurt community would invite Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch to become their rabbi, and he would have to resuscitate it from the dead. And this in this little tiny town with a tiny little, almost like a shtetl, 20, 30 families in Michelstadt. He's a kabbalist, and a well-known one, and people are coming in from all over, whatever religious people are still around, and there's probably a dwindling number, and they're probably more elderly. But it's fascinating that in that context, he has a yeshiva, and he has students. It's almost like it's like hard to believe that this is happening in Western Germany, Southwestern Germany, in the old traditional Ashkenaz, in a place that's rapidly secularizing. All of a sudden, there's an Eastern European type of kabbalist mystic who uses shemus of Kabbalah, who uses practical Kabbalah and kabbalistic formulas, and is a healer and heals people with this. These three points combine to make a very, very unique story. Now, where did he become this mystic? So he grew up in, like I said, in 1768, he's born, he grows up in Michelstadt, but soon he goes over to Frankfurt, which is literally next door. And who is the great kabbalist of Frankfurt at this time? Rav Nosson Adler. So he becomes a close student of his, and Rav Nosson Adler has this decisive impact on his life. I did see one source that said that he studied by Rav Nosson Adler at the same time as the Chassam Sofer, Michelstadt, who of course grew up in Frankfurt and was the closest student of Rav Nosson Adler, and the two of them were there together. I personally find it a bit unlikely, and I'll explain why. The Chassam Sofer left Frankfurt with Rav Nosson Adler in 1782. When he was 20 years old. The Baal Shem of Michelstadt, the future Baal Shem of Michelstadt, was 14 at this time. Rav Nosson Adler only returned to Frankfurt a bunch of years later, like 5-6 years later, and he was without the Chassam Sofer. So either the Baal Shem either the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, Rav Zekl Leib, Vormser, either he studied under Rav Nosson Adler before the age of 14, which is definitely possible. That's definitely an option. In which case he would have been there together with the Chassam Sofer. So in that scenario, it does work out. If he came at the age of 11 or 12 or whatever from Michelstadt to Frankfurt to study by Rav Nosson Adler, then he would have been there together with the Chassam Sofer. That's definitely a possibility. Or the alternative possibility is when Rav Nosson Adler returned to Frankfurt, when the Baal Shem of Michelstadt was 19 or 20 or so, when Rav Nosson Adler returned to Frankfurt, and this time without the Chassam Sofer, and then he would not have been there together with the Chassam Sofer. But the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, his entire approach to life and Yiddishkeit was really defined by his connection to Rav Nosson Adler, his aesthetic practices, the practical Kabbalah, can all be said to have been shaped by Rav Nosson Adler, and therefore he had a decisive impact on his life trajectory. So, like I said, he was born in 1768 in Michelstadt. He studied locally, eventually nearby Frankfurt, not only by Rav Nosson Adler, but also by the rabbi of the Frankfurt community at the time, Rav Pinchas Horowitz, the Afla. And as was relatively common for gifted students in Germany during the 18th century, and Reb Zekl Leib was a gifted student, he also studied science and philosophy and Kabbalah, of course, especially as a result of his connection with Rav Nosson Adler. And then he returns to Michelstadt and studied in relative solitude for several years. He was married at this point. He had married a girl from Frankfurt. Michelstadt was a tiny Jewish community of 20, 30 families, as were Jewish families, as were many small towns of southern Germany in the Rhine River Valley throughout its history, basically right up till the war. And he... Reb Zekl Leib, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, was eventually appointed rabbi of the town. So he becomes the official rabbi, and Paisik and halacha and everything. Now, some in the community were opposed to his appointment because he was seen as this eccentric mystic who did some funny things in his asceticism and all his practices, especially his use of practical Kabbalah, which was seen across the European Jewish world as suspect in the post-Shabsai Tzvi trauma Jewish society, but especially so in Germany, even more so than in other communities. And there's a lot to say on this topic in general, and one day we'll have to get back to Shabsai Tzvi and the post-Shabsai Tzvi world. It's something that we haven't really yet covered in Jewish History Soundbites. One day we'll get to that. So they were suspicious of him. So some of them didn't want him. The Baal Shem of Michelstadt also told his petitioners or clients or patients or followers or those who sought his advice and blessing, whatever you want to call the people who came to him, to do all sorts of segulas for their healing or other salvation as needed, and that was seen as suspect. But despite the opposition, he was still appointed. He established a yeshiva here at the time. When his first wife passed away, he remarried, and the second wife's name was Chana. She lived in Mannheim, which is another town nearby, old German Jewish kehillah nearby, and he moved there for a time. So he left Michelstadt, and it was actually here that he achieved more of his fame. He became more renowned as a healer because he successfully treated a prominent patient in Mannheim who suffered from some sort of severe mental illness. And it was said that his fame spread across Central and even Eastern Europe, that people knew about him across the European Jewish world. And it is said that even the Chassam Sofer and possibly even different Hasidic rebbes in Poland, maybe even the Chidushei Arim, himself requested of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt that he pray on their behalf, which would be fascinating. And I have not been able to verify that, but that's what is definitely related. Now, as part of his kabbalistic mystical practices, he was also a vegetarian, which I've seen quite a few times, and I'm fascinated by the subject that I've seen by different various tzaddikim throughout history, especially the ones who had a relationship with kabbalistic practice or study, and I just discovered this about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt as well. Now, upon his return to Michelstadt a couple of years later, he reestablished his yeshiva, and he personally taught the students there. In addition to the normative curriculum of Gemara and Halacha that was accepted in the yeshivas at the time, Kabbalah was also taught, which shouldn't come as a surprise because of who the Baal Shem of Michelstadt was. But what is more surprising is that he also included in the curriculum general subjects such as math and philosophy, which may be a bit surprising. But as many as 70 students studied in the yeshiva at one time, which for Germany was considered a pretty large and prestigious yeshiva. In 1825, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt's house burnt down, along with all of his possessions and all of his Torah writings. Almost all of his Torah writings. Very little was salvaged. A couple of Sfarim of his were published over the years. They tried to gather different stuff that were saved, and there have been a couple of Sfarim which were published of his, but for the most part, everything was lost. He passed away on Tzom Gedalia in 1847 and is buried, as I said, in Michelstadt, where we go till today with the groups. In 1910, which is 63 years after his passing, a plaque was placed by his home stating that he resided there by the city, the municipal authorities of Michelstadt, and it said something along the lines of, in this house lived the friend of man, Zekl Leib Vormser, from the year 1826 until his passing in 1847, dedicated by his native town Michelstadt in 1910. The plaque, of course, was removed by the Nazis, and his tombstone was desecrated and destroyed by the Nazis in 1947, which was the centennial of his passing. Both were replaced through the efforts of one or two of his descendants. He had quite a few descendants, a large family, and till today, proud descendants of his. Now, there are many stories and legends that abound about him in his own lifetime, and even more so following his passing, mostly about his ability to pray, to bless, to heal petitioners who requested his assistance, and also those who went to pray at his gravesite, who saw the same results. Now, these style stories generally don't fit into the framework of the Jewish History Soundbites podcast, as this focuses more on his life and the historical context of the society in which he lived and operated. But I do want to point out another aspect of his legacy, which will include a story that is related about him. And that is the book that was written about him by a very, very important German rabbi of the 19th century, Rabbi Dr. Naftali Herz Ehrman, who was a German Orthodox rabbi and one of the great German Orthodox rabbinical leaders in the late 19th century. He was close with Rav Hirsch. He was close with a lot of people. He was also close with Eastern European rabbis, and Yisrael Salanter, and when he lived in Germany, and he traveled to Chabad. He was close with the Lubavitcher rabbis. And he wrote many books. He was a great author. He was a great rabbi. He was a great leader, and he wrote many books. And one of the books he wrote was a biography, ostensibly a biography of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. Of course, he wrote it in German for it to be reading material, for literature, for the Orthodox Jewish youth of Germany. And eventually it was translated into a bunch of languages. I know for sure it was translated into English, into Hebrew, possibly other languages as well. Now I want to go through one of the more famous stories from the book and analyze it a bit, because I think it tells a lot about not only the Baal Shem of Michelstadt and his legacy among German Jews, but a lot about the context of what Rabbi Dr. Naftali Herz Ehrman was trying to accomplish by writing this book. So I'm not going to read the story. I'm just going to give a short synopsis, because there's a lot to learn from the fact and the way that Rabbi Dr. Ehrman relates this story about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, why he did it, and what he did, and what the context is. There was this Reb Zeligman, who is the fundraiser for the Baal Shem of Michelstadt's yeshiva in Michelstadt, and he was a bit concerned because his entire livelihood was dependent on the fact that there was a yeshiva there and the Baal Shem of Michelstadt at its helm. So he was concerned that following the passing, and as the Baal Shem of Michelstadt was getting elderly, he passed away, he was I think 79 or 80, which was quite old in the 19th century. So as he was getting on in years, this Reb Zeligman was a bit concerned that following the passing of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, the yeshiva was going to shut down, and how is he going to make a living? So the Baal Shem of Michelstadt told him to continue traveling, but instead of fundraising, he should tell stories about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. Now, this Reb Zeligman was a little nervous, understandably. He's going to go around telling stories. People are going to give him money. Like, how's that going to work exactly? He's going to make a living off of telling stories about his mentor, about his teacher, about his employer, essentially. He was a little nervous about it. But at some point, he heard that a very wealthy Jew in Venice, in Italy, loves stories about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt and is willing to pay good money to hear them. So Reb Zeligman resolved to go to Italy to meet him. And he goes there, and sure enough, he forgets all the stories that he wanted to say. He knew hundreds of stories, and he forgot all of them. And everyone was disappointed, and he stayed over Shabbos, and every time they tried to say, do you remember any? I can't remember a single story. And everyone's all upset and disappointed, and he stayed another few days, and he wanted to leave. He was embarrassed, and the host said, no, stay a few more days, and you'll eventually remember them. And finally, he gave up, and he was about to leave. He's walking out the door, and all of a sudden he said, I remember one story. It's the only one I remembered. It just hit me. So the guy says, okay, let's sit down. Tell me the story. She said it was in 1830, and it was Easter, the Christian holiday of Easter, and the Baal Shem of Michelstadt traveled with Reb Zeligman to some town south of Germany, I think in Italy somewhere. And during the Easter ceremony in this town, there was a whole huge mob and crowd and a very religious ceremony. In the 19th century, still, it wasn't medieval times, it wasn't really so dangerous as it used to be for Jews, but it still had that, danger. Jews stay away from these ceremonies. And in the middle of the ceremony, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt tells Reb Zeligman, go approach the officiating bishop of the town of this ceremony and whisper in his ear that Reb Zekl Leib of Michelstadt is here and wants to speak with you. So he goes over, even though it's dangerous to do so in the middle of this religious crowd during this very religious Christian ceremony, but Baal Shem said so he complied. So the bishop says, all right, I'll come in a half hour. So Reb Zeligman goes back to the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, who insisted that no, he has to come immediately. So Reb Zeligman returns with the message, and the bishop asked another priest to take over the ceremony, and he went to go speak to the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. They enclosed themselves in a room for a couple of hours, and then parted ways. And that's the end of the story. Reb Zeligman tells his host in Venice, I don't know what happened afterwards, but this is the story that I remember about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. The fellow in turn was ecstatic. He jumped up, he recited the Shechianu blessing with great intensity and excitement, and he then explained to the astounded Zeligman fellow that he was that bishop. He had been a student of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt in his yeshiva, and he was somehow got involved with a local priest who convinced him to convert to Christianity, and he disappeared, and he eventually rose through the ranks of the church, and he became a bishop, and he several years later had his regrets, and he felt guilty about it, and he wanted to return to his faith, so he initiated a correspondence with his former teacher, Reb Zekl Leib, the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, who tried to convince him to abandon Christianity and return to his old faith, but it was challenging. He was used to it, he was comfortable, it was hard to leave. So they maintained this correspondence for some time, and finally this priest, this bishop, whatever it was, he finally tells his former rebbe that he's leaving everything after this coming up Easter ceremony. So the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, went to there on his Easter ceremony to make sure that he leaves, and in his talk with him in that seclusion for 2 hours, he gave him clear guidance, how to repent for his many sins, a whole process of tshuva, of repentance. He guided him exactly what he should do and how to do it and everything, gave him very specific and clear instructions. And at the end of their meeting, he said that if someone one day relates this story to you, then it's a sign from heaven that you've been forgiven. But if no one comes and relates the story to you, then you're still not forgiven, and you have to continue with your tshuva process. So when Reb Zeligman arrived at this guy's house, he recognized him. He said, he's that guy who was with us at the time that the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, and he was hoping that he's going to relate the story. And then when his guest forgot all his stories, the host, this Italian Jew, former bishop, a former student of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, he realized that he was still required to do additional repentance, and he prayed that his guest would recall the story, and which he did, and he finished his repentance, and he rewarded his Zeligman generously, and of course the end of the story is that they lived happily ever after. And as far as I know, this is a well-known story, and it's so well-known, in fact, that it is said about a different Baal Shem. It's said about the Baal Shem Tov himself. A story with all its details, pretty much, is recorded about the Baal Shem Tov. And in fact, this story has all the ingredients of a classic Hasidic story, and the details themselves seem to have been, just adapted to the reality in the context of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, but it was lifted from almost the exact same story about the Baal Shem Tov of the Hasidic movement. In fact, this Reb Naftali Hertz Ehrman was close with Hasidic groups, as I mentioned, specifically Chabad. One of his other books that he wrote is about the life of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya. And it's likely that while he was in Lubavitch, he even heard this story about the Baal Shem Tov, and he deliberately decided to recast it about the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, which, he wanted to include in his book. Now, why would Reb Naftali Hertz Ehrman do that? It was a very positive reason. Think about the context of Orthodoxy in Germany at the time. They're small, they're on the defensive. Literature is used and utilized as one of its weapons, especially fiction literature. There was the works and writings of Solomon Plessner, even more famously of Marcus Lehman. Naftali Hertz Ehrman is right there and there's others. And this literature needs heroes. It needs stories. It needs tzaddikim stories. They can't tell it about the tzaddikim of Eastern Europe. They can't tell them about the Hasidic movement. That's not going to inspire the Orthodox youth. But they can show that even Yekkis in German Orthodoxy of the 19th century, of not long before, he passed away 30, 40 years earlier at this time, here was someone who was a German Orthodox hero. He was well versed in general subjects. He was the rabbi of his town. He was a Rosh Yeshiva. And he was also a kabbalist, a mystic, who was a hero, who was a holy Jew, who was able to perform miracles, was able to be a healer, was able to help people, was able to bring them salvation and be there for others and take on their responsibility and their needs in many areas. And the story, now, by the way, Litvaks, before you get too excited that it's that you're excluded from this, Litvaks did and do even today, and even if they don't like to admit it. So it's in all cultures, it's in all communities, it exists everywhere. This story is important as a story because of its cultural context, because of its folklore value, because of what it forges as a communal identity, because it's a transmission of values, and all of this is important. And it's not so important about whether the story itself took place or not. And therefore, Ehrman justifiably, at least in my view, and I think that all historians agree on that, is that it's totally fine to adapt that story to a new reality, to be able to give it over to that generation of readers, to the young Orthodox German readers that he was trying to cater to. But it also says a lot about the legacy of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. He was that person. He was that Yeki Tzaddik. He was kind of like the Yeki Reb Shaila of Kerestir, this Mekubal, this Tzaddik, with somewhat limited influence in his lifetime, although he was quite well known and renowned. But he wasn't this national leader like Rav Nosson Adler or something like that. But with the power of prayer, the power of salvation, through his reputation as a Baal Shem, that influence continued after his passing, and certainly has increased after his passing, especially in recent years. So you have, when we go, there's the cemetery in Frankfurt, the old cemetery where Rav Nosson Adler is buried, where the Pnei Yeshua is buried, where the Hafla is buried. There's the new cemetery where Shamshon Rafal Hirsch is buried. It's also a Hasidic Rebbe, actually, the Stalin Rebbe, the Yanuka. But then we go out to Michelstadt and we say, hey, don't forget, this is in Yeki land, in Germany, there was also the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. In the century after the Hasidic movement was already spreading, the century after the Baal Shem Tov, in Western Europe, in a century of German secularization, there arose this great tzaddik, this great kabbalist, who was well known and even utilized in the literature and in the stories that are related and continue to be related till today. One last point, it's also, before the last point, it's also a technicality. The proximity to the Frankfurt airport, which is a very common airport for stopover flights, makes it very easy and very accessible for people to go visit him. It's very common. That's another reason, and it's always convenient to be buried near an airport. Like Chassam Sofer near the Vienna airport is also a great thing to have. So just keep that in mind when you want to bury the next tzaddik. It should be near an airport and things like that. One last point is that in many descendants, prominent descendants, a couple of his more famous descendants in Germany, one of his great-grandsons was Shmuel Strauss, and he was very close with the Alter of Kelm, with other members of the Vormser movement from Eastern Europe, and he sponsored in Yerushalayim, in the Musrara neighborhood in Yerushalayim, he bought a piece of real estate, which the Balei Musar, the prominent members of the Musar movement who moved to Yerushalayim, they lived there. It was called Chatzer Strauss, and Shmuel Strauss was a very, very important person who funded the Musar movement, who funded Kelm, and who funded the Chatzer Strauss, where many members of the Musar movement who moved to the land of Israel, including the Alter of Kelm's brother, Bari Lebroide, and the Raftali Amsterdam at the end of his life, and Rabbi Tzila Petterberg at the end of his life, two prominent students of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Later on, Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank grew up in Chatzer Strauss. The Rabbi Simcha Zissel Broide, the German Rosh Yeshiva, who was obviously a descendant of the Alter of Kelm's family from that brother, also grew up in Chatzer Strauss, and many others. So this Shmuel Strauss was a direct descendant of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt, and through him, his son-in-law was Morenu Jacob Rosenheim of the Agudas Yisrael, the founder and the president of Agudas Yisrael, lived a long and fruitful life. So he was a son-in-law, so he's not direct descendant. He married into the family, but his children, of course, were descendants as well. And that's just two examples of the family of the Baal Shem of Michelstadt. There's many others as well. So the Baal Shem of Michelstadt and his legacy is a very important story in the history of German Jewry and of the 19th century, and a bit different, a bit off the beaten track. And as we have more and more trips, hopefully going to Germany, we hope to bring many groups to Michelstadt to pray and be zeiche, to be payoltois alles gits. This is Yehuda Geber, Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.